Welcome to the Peak of Geek, where we've hit the top but with no plans to stop. You know, in most modern video games where your playable character is a heavily armed soldier, the main gameplay loop is gunning down everything in sight. And depending on your skill level, you may accidentally take out a few teammates along the way.
Yeah. No, that was me again. I'm sorry.
But one particular game would hit store shelves in 1987 to turn that stereotype on its head. Interestingly, the design choice to have the playable character avoid enemy forces instead of, shooting them all, didn't come from a creative new idea, but a creative response to hardware limitations. But like they say, everything happens for a reason, because that one choice would eventually grow and evolve into a franchise that may have ended story-wise almost a decade ago, but its legacy continues to live on. The legacy of Metal Gear! So let's talk about how this series began before it exploded into popularity with the PlayStation classic Metal Gear Solid. In the 1980s, Hideo Kojima still wanted to be a filmmaker. As a child, a friend once brought a Super 8 camera to school, and they would make movies together. Once, they even went to an island off the coast of Japan to make a film that ended up being about zombies. Can you tell it was the 80s? While Kojima was studying economics in university, he would write novels in his spare time, hoping that one day they might even win some awards so he could transition into the film industry. But in 1983, something incredible happened. The Family Computer, or Famicom, released in Japan, 3 years before North America would see it as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. When Kojima witnessed this evolution in video game technology, he realized he could tell his stories in a new interactive way. Maybe this could be better than being a filmmaker. Then, in 1986, Kojima would take a chance. He applied to work for a video game company called Konami and ended up in its home computer division designing games for the MSX. The MS what? The MSX was a personal computer created by Microsoft for the Eastern sector. Japanese manufacturers like Sony, Panasonic, and Samsung deliberately avoided the crowded US market where Commodore computers already had a strong foothold. So while it was virtually ignored in the West, the MSX would become extremely popular in Japan and also find an audience across Europe and in Brazil. And before the Famicom would take over the gaming world, companies like Konami and Hudson Soft made quite a few games for the MSX, MSX2, and MSX2 Plus. But when Kojima joined the team at Konami, he was initially disappointed to find himself designing games for the MSX's limited color palette. Well, limited when compared to the NES. And to make matters worse, the first game he was assigned to work on was cancelled mid-development. Not much was known about Lost World, but a few years ago, a magazine clipping surfaced detailing its existence. A single screenshot shows the protagonist Jamie and mentions that while sailing on the Titanic with her husband, the world-famous ship didn't actually hit an iceberg and sink, but instead collided with a mysterious floating continent. I mean, just by that plot description, this game sounds like it would have been pretty awesome. Reminds me of that PC adventure game, Titanic Adventure Out of Time. What? Am I the only one who remembers that 90s FMV gem? Despite starting off his video game career with a cancelled project, Kojima would soon join another team, although in a much more limited capacity, for a game called Penguin Adventure, released in 1986 for the MSX. This sequel to Antarctic Adventure follows Penta, a penguin who must find a golden apple to cure the penguin princess. It's a cute little action game, and while Kojima goes uncredited, he did help with designing both the in-game shop and the boss battles. Soon after, Kojima was asked to take over production of an action game that would have featured modern military combat. As director and designer, Kojima quickly learned that even with the MSX2's improved video, audio, and RAM, the limited hardware capabilities still meant that only so many enemies and so many bullets could be displayed on screen, effectively ruining the idea of an action shooter. So, as a self-proclaimed cinephile, Kojima turned to the movies for inspiration. He decided to redesign the game based on The Great Escape, a 1963 film about a group of British POWs who escaped from a German camp during World War II. Now, tentatively titled Intruder, the game would be all about carefully avoiding the enemy while sneaking around. Before release, the game would change its name in reference to a major boss encounter, Metal Gear. As Solid Snake, the newest recruit in Special Forces Unit Foxhound, you're sent to Outer Heaven in South Africa to rescue fellow soldier Grey Fox, and to find out more about an alleged weapon of mass destruction. Snake may be on his mission alone, but he can use his codec to stay in radio communication with some of the local resistance members. While exploring Outer Heaven, Snake will need to rescue hostages while seeking out weapons and items to help him stay alive, open doors, and solve puzzles. And he'll need all the help he can get if he has any hope of defeating Metal Gear, the nuclear-equipped walking bipedal tank. Because if Snake is spotted by the enemy, they'll chase you down. And while you can take them out with your fists or your weapons, since this is the first ever stealth game, you might find it more satisfying to find your way forward without anyone knowing you were ever there. But that doesn't mean you can reach the end credits without firing a single bullet. In fact, the boss fights in Metal Gear are easily some of the most memorable moments in the game. Get ready to take down several Outer Heaven mercenaries along with giant death machines like a Hind-D helicopter and a missile-firing tank. You'll be making full use of your arsenal, including your pistol, grenade launcher, plastic explosives, and more, in order to exploit your enemy's weaknesses and come out on top. Another major element in this game that would become a series mainstay is the card key system. Every time you find a new numbered card key, you'll want to revisit previous areas to find new items and weapons, and rescue all the hostages you can find, since doing so raises your class, which increases your health and the amount of healing items and ammunition you can carry. There's a real sense of progression here, and the limited bits of story you get as you make your way through Outer Heaven will keep you moving forwards as you explore the impressive layout, which consists of 3 detailed buildings and a desert with many tricks and traps along the way. While Metal Gear is fun and addictive to play, even today, it can also be frustrating at times. While this wasn't an NES game yet, it is definitely NES hard. It can be difficult to understand where to go next, or what item or weapon you need to proceed. Oftentimes the hostages you rescue and the local resistance members you can call in your codec will support you, but it's still easy to get stuck or lost. These minor nitpicks aside, the journey through Metal Gear is well worth it. And if you consider yourself a Metal Gear Solid fan, but you've never experienced its roots, you should totally find out where it all started. Major and memorable characters like Solid Snake, Big Boss, Grey Fox, Metal Gear, and gameplay elements like communicating via codec, finding that minesweeper so you don't randomly explode, and sneaking around in a cardboard box all originated from this first game. And that music? Most of the time I wanted to get spotted by the enemies so I could jam out to the amazing song that plays while you fight them off or run away. Despite the limitations of the MSX2, Kojima still managed to develop a groundbreaking gameplay experience that created a whole new genre of game, while telling a very mature, serious story about the devastating effects of war and betrayal, with some signature Kojima-style fourth wall breaking moments. No spoilers here, check it out for yourself if you want to know. Soon after the release of Metal Gear, Kojima would move on to his next project, Snatcher, a cyberpunk adventure game with action-packed shooting segments. This is a game we'll need to go into more detail another time, but we'll just say that while Kojima was busy, Konami took it upon themselves to port Metal Gear to the Famicom. And unfortunately, this lesser version is the one we'd see released on the NES in 1988. Kojima would later explain that another Konami division was given Metal Gear source code. They were told to make it as different as possible and have it ready for release in just 3 months. These strict and confusing demands, coupled with Kojima's lack of creative involvement, made for an inferior gameplay experience. And unfortunately, this is the version that would get ported again to Commodore 64 and MS-DOS. But hey, sometimes ignorance is bliss, and Western gamers who only experienced the NES port mostly enjoyed what they got. Hilarious translation issues, baffling changes, and clunky gameplay aside, the essence of Metal Gear is still present here, even though the actual boss Metal Gear has been replaced by a supercomputer guarded by a few soldiers. Talk about a letdown. But despite these unknowing sacrifices, the NES version went on to sell very well, leaving a legacy of its own. But if only people knew what they were missing. Okay, it's probably abundantly clear that this botched port of Metal Gear is not something I enjoy, but I do have to give it credit. If it wasn't for this port and its Western popularity, the franchise may have ended before it had the chance to truly begin. because in 1990, Konami decided to create a Western-only sequel dubbed Snake's Revenge, again without the involvement of Kojima. You wonder why he left. But this time, one of the developers tasked with working on Snake's Revenge decided to let Kojima know what was happening and asked him to create a true sequel. So later that year, Japanese audiences would experience the next real chapter in Snake's story, with Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake on MSX2 is in many ways a demake of Metal Gear Solid. It's almost like playing the iconic PlayStation game, but in 2D instead of 3D. There are tons of gameplay elements, characters, and moments that fans would instantly recognize. For example, you can track enemies by radar in the top right of your screen. You can also kneel or crawl to make less noise, and traverse underneath vehicles, sneak through vents, or avoid enemy capture by hiding in tight spaces. You're also aided via codec by now familiar characters like Commanding Officer Roy Campbell, Survivalist Master McDonald Miller, who's exactly who he says he is this time,
Nudge, nudge, snap, snap, grin, grin, wink, wink, say no more.
and our old pal Gray Fox is still around. Plot-wise, this one follows Snake, now retired, brought back for one final mission. Yeah, right, sure. His mission? To rescue Dr. Kiyomar from the forces occupying Zanzibar land in Central Asia. There's also a potential love interest in Holly White and several other returning characters from the first game. Overall, this game feels like a major upgrade over the last one. Controlling Snake feels a lot smoother, and with the new radar system, it feels less unfair when you're spotted by an enemy soldier. Now the blame rests on you. Not only are the boss fights more involved, there's more of them. And this time, the Hind D helicopter doesn't sit still and shoot at you. It will come for you, and you will need to run. And again, the music is incredible. Part of me wants to watch the opening movie over and over just to hear that song. Man, so good. Similarly, the story Kojima tells in this sequel feels a lot more fleshed out and almost cinematic, especially when compared to the original and maybe any other game at the time. There are much longer codec calls and characters feel more like real people, even some of the enemies you fight along the way. You can also talk to more NPCs other than the hostages you rescue. Throughout Zanzibar land, you'll find children who have been rescued by the base's mysterious leader, who will offer up hints on where to go next. Unlike the first game, Metal Gear 2 is much more forgiving with its difficulties. You have more opportunities when it comes to using your codec or exploring the world for support and finding out where to go next. With a little creative thinking, you won't be stuck or lost for long in this game. And yes, if you've played Metal Gear Solid, a lot of this game will feel familiar. Similar to how watching Evil Dead 2 feels like watching the original, if you know, you know. The plot beats and the characters may be different, but there's a lot of commonalities that almost feels like Metal Gear Solid was Kojima's way of revisiting elements from Metal Gear 2 and doing it better, with more developer experience and advances in technology. That being said, even if you've played Metal Gear Solid multiple times, it's still worth experiencing what came before. There's a lot of charm to this 8-bit adventure that you won't find in its 3D counterpart. While Metal Gear Solid was like playing a movie, especially for the time with its well-directed cutscenes and lengthy codec calls with voice acting that still holds up today, Metal Gear 2 put the addictive stealth gameplay, exploration, and thrilling boss fights front and center. And with the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection that was recently released on all modern platforms, Metal Gear 1 and 2 have never been more accessible. Throughout the years, Kojima would continue to experiment with developing games that almost feel like playing interactive movies. His next new project after Metal Gear 2 was Policenauts, an adventure action game that felt like a spiritual successor to Snatcher. Still, Kojima would continue to return to the Metal Gear series, with several Metal Gear Solid sequels and spin-offs, before finishing off the series in 2015 with Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. But before parting ways with Metal Gear and Konami altogether, Kojima would try his hand at the horror genre with PT, an incredible demo he co-directed with filmmaker Guillermo del Toro that was meant as a teaser for a new Silent Hill game. Unfortunately, despite fans calling the teaser one of the best horror experiences of all time, man, was it ever. The full game was eventually cancelled due to tensions Kojima experienced during the development of Metal Gear Solid 5.
Snake, are you okay? Snake? Snake!
While the ending of Kojima's relationship with Konami was bittersweet, at least nowadays he's free to make whatever he wants. And in 2019, he proved that with the release of Death Stranding, a one-of-a-kind action game that might be too complicated to explain here, but I'll give it a try. It's an open-world action game where you control Norman Reedus, making deliveries throughout a devastated United States. You're carrying a baby that lets you see invisible monsters like giant tar whales that you have to fight, and as expected, there are lots of Kojima-style cutscenes to enjoy. Oh, and Guillermo del Toro and Mads Mikkelsen are there too. Weird doesn't even come close to explaining this one. But hey, a sequel is coming, and so is a film adaptation from A24. I'm sure Kojima is overjoyed. And during the Game Awards in December 2023, a brand new Kojima title was teased, a horror game simply known as OD. According to the man himself, this mysterious Xbox Game Studios project will explore the concept of testing your fear threshold and what it means to OD on fear. Whatever that means, I guess we'll all find out together. The term auteur, referring to an author, typically a film director with a distinctive style, is usually reserved for artists like Alfred Hitchcock or David Lynch. But many would agree that Hideo Kojima deserves a spot on that list of celebrated creators. And just like watching the unsettling short films David Lynch made in art school before working on Eraserhead, it's well worth exploring where Kojima's ongoing career first began. His dedicated and unique vision can be found in those early 8-bit Metal Gear games, and I fully recommend checking them out. But what about you? Do you follow game creators like some people follow directors? Are you interested in exploring the origins of someone's career? Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, hey Konami, since you canceled Silent Hills, that means the upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake and the new entry Silent Hill F are going to be even better, right? Right?